I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Okay. Well, welcome back to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. This month, we're lucky to have on Harry Murray from Syracuse, New York. I guess, Harry, you could introduce yourself better than I could.
Well, yeah. Nowadays, I'm from Rochester now.
Okay.
A lot of my Catholic worker experience was in Syracuse, but
Gotcha.
and I don't know. I'm a professor emeritus of sociology at what is now called Nazareth University, but for all of my career was Nazareth College, which seems a more appropriate name. And I've been involved with the Catholic worker at least on a part-time basis since about the late 1970s. So I've been around for a while, so to speak, and I did write what is probably the worst-selling book in the history of Catholic worker literature, To Do Not Neglect Hospitality, which was based on my dissertation and my participant observation at three different Catholic worker houses of hospitality: the St. Joe's in New York City, St. Joe's in Rochester, New York, and the Mustard Seed in Worcester, Mass. But that was all conducted in the early 1980s. But I think amazingly enough, all three of those houses are still going, sometimes in somewhat different forms. But so I guess that's about it.
Yeah. So what would you say drew you into the worker, and what sustained you in your continued engagement?
Oh, well, I first heard about the worker in college. I went to Holy Cross in Massachusetts, graduated in 73. And my senior year, I went on an 8-day version of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And there were only seven of us students on the retreat, but two of the people on the retreat were Holy Cross dropouts who had dropped out of the college to join the anti-war movement and were coming back to Worcester to start a Catholic worker house, the Mustard Seed. And so that was the first I heard about Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And it seemed kind of strange to me. They had just rented a a storefront in the city of Worcester, and we're just welcoming people in for clothes, for coffee, for some food. Um, and it was my senior year, so I had much better things to do with my life. I was going on to Cornell to get a master's in city planning and, you know, do something important and make some money while I was at it. Um, but one other thing happened at Holy Cross, which was our graduation speaker um, was Dan Berrigan. This was 1973. Um, he had just recently gotten out of prison for the Catonsville Nine action, and I've been a professor for over 30 years, so I've heard a lot of graduation speeches, but his was the one that I always remember. He kind of started off, "Wow, you've graduated. Aren't you proud? You're winners now. You've bought into that whole American winner-loser mythology, and you're winners. You don't have to worry about those losers anymore. So you should be so proud of yourselves." And then he started telling some Zen parables about winner and loser societies. And I think about half the parents had walked out by that time. I'm probably exaggerating, but I know mine weren't pleased at all. But it was the last thing I expected to hear at a graduation ceremony, and so that got me thinking too. I went on to get my master's in city planning at Cornell and worked there on a research project. But I kept reading, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and that led me to read Berdyaev and Mounier and et cetera. And then in about 1976 or so, I met up with a friend from grade school who had also heard about the Catholic Worker, and we decided to go and visit Dorothy Day and the New York Catholic Worker. And signals, it was a life-changing trip for me. I was in the same building as Dorothy, but she was old and sick at that point, and so I never actually met her. That was as close as I got. Um, and I had gone up to the world top of the World Trade Center that morning and kind of saw that tremendous view, the kind of the symbol of American economic wealth and power, and then got down and walked about a mile and saw a poverty that I had never experienced in my life, stepping over uh, folks who were asleep on the sidewalk, um, and going to St. Joseph's House in New York City, and it soon became kind of apparent that uh, by the time we got there, the meal was over, and there was nobody in charge of entertaining bemused middle class visitors. So we started going around the dining room, and there were maybe about 20 people in the dining room. And so we'd go over to one group of people and ask, "Who are you?" And they'd say, "Well, we're Catholic workers helping those people over there." And so we go to those people over there, and we're Catholic workers helping those people over there. And pretty soon we'd been all around the room, and everybody was Catholic workers helping those people over there, and nobody was being helped. Um, and when you go into a social service agency, you know immediately who are the staff and who are the clients. All kinds of clues to tell you that. But Jimmy and I spent 8 hours at the Catholic Worker, joining in evening prayer and all that. And the first thing we did was go to a bar in Greenwich Village and debate who was running the place. because we after 8 hours we and I mean I said I think it was that middle-aged guy, and Jim said no, he told me he just got out of the mental hospital a week ago. And we just could not figure it out, so it befuddled me. And I got a list of Catholic worker houses and I was still at Cornell, and I started volunteering at Unity Kitchen up in Syracuse, New York, which was a Catholic worker type house, which served 2 meals a day to anyone who came, and ran a night shelter for men, which I think had 38 or 48 beds, but slept as many folks as came. And when the beds were filled, people slept in chairs, and when the chairs were filled, people slept in the spaces between the beds on the floor with just a pillow. And started doing one night a week there in the shelter, driving up from Ithaca, and after a while found that several of the folks who were running the house were going to leave, and so I quit my job and joined the workers at Unity Kitchen, and stayed there for 2 years. This would have been about 1977 through 79. Maybe symbolic, but I got my first black eye the day that I told the workers that I was going to come and live there. We were breaking up a fight in the dormitory. The kitchen, for being a house of nonviolence, was a fairly violent place, and in retrospect, afterwards, I think that was because the folks who were running it were all young men, and we sort of had this ethic that, women can't do this. And when I would later come to St. Joseph's House in Rochester, New York, I really, I really learned how foolish that was. I found that women could calm down potential violence, break up fights far more effectively than men could, in part because with men there's also always that macho factor, no matter how you try to present yourself. Whereas for a woman, a man could always say, "Well, I beat the crap out of you, but for her sake, I'm gonna lay off." Whereas they wouldn't do that for a man. If that, and so I ended up spending 2 years living and working at Unity Kitchen. There, one of the folks who was running the place was a guy named Henry Nicolella, who's still a good friend, and kind of taught me how to be a Catholic worker. Henry is about the most nonviolent, gentle person I know, and the kindest. I mean, you could have someone who pulled a knife on him, and the most Henry would say is, "Gee, he was pesky today."
Can I interrupt you for just a second and ask, like, what job did you quit to do this, and what did the people think from the job? What did they think of that decision?
I think they think I was nuts. I was working for a professor at Cornell. We were doing a study of preschool programs for low-income children. This was, this had started in the 1970s when Richard Nixon was threatening to close down Head Start because there had been a recent study by Westinghouse Learning Corp and Ohio University, not Ohio State, that claimed that Head Start really had no significant long-term effects. And we put together the the results from, or the data from 13 different studies, which were fairly small studies, but kind of quasi-experimental, which did a reasonable job of creating a comparison group of children who were poor, who had not had Head Start. And I flew around the country. There was no internet at that point, and brought the data to Cornell, on Hollerith cards, if anybody remembers what those were, long before you had internet or computer tapes or discs or anything like that. It was all on cardboard, little punch cards. And and I had spent a couple years putting that report together, and eventually Jimmy Carter cited the report as a justification for continuing and expanding Head Start. So that was what I was doing, and um, they kind of thought when I came back to work with the black eye, because I didn't quit immediately. People were very confused because they never I was, kind of a little bookworm, and nobody was expecting me to come back with a black eye. They thought I was nuts, but Irving, who ran the project, was was very generous. I didn't have any salary, of course, at Unity Kitchen, and so when I ran out of money, I would call up Irving and ask if I could come and consult for a couple days, and I would take a couple days off and go down and consult and come back with enough money to keep me going for another 6 months or so. Um, and when I eventually left the kitchen, I went back and worked on the same project. I had kind of created the data set, so they were happy to bring me back, if that's helpful. So yeah, so I mean, the experience at the kitchen just really kind of transformed me. I got to know the lives of people who are poor, people who of different races, different sexualities. Everybody came to the kitchen, um, and also got to kind of test out nonviolence, um, because, as I said, there was a fair amount of violence at the kitchen, and we had to kind of use nonviolent tactics to try to break up fights, and I kind of learned that I could do that, and usually fairly successfully. Although I am really clumsy, so one time I was trying to pull someone off someone else and tripped as I was doing it, so that I ended up driving the guy into the ground, and everybody jumped back, startled, like, Harry, don't, what's going on here? And I mean, it was purely my clumsiness, but it turned into, I guess, what was kind of violent. Um, but I learned that, if you are thinking about what's going on, if you're willing to listen to what has someone upset, that you can often resolve situations without violence. And that became a really important thing for me, because it, I was moving in the direction of challenging my government's violence. And I kind of first, to feel really comfortable with doing that, um, I, I first had to experience that nonviolence could be fruitful, at the interpersonal level. Um, and Syracuse was the home of the Berrigan family. Um, Dan and Phil Berrigan of Catonsville 9 fame weren't there, but their brother Jerry and his wife Carol were there, and they were both very faithful volunteers at Unity Kitchen. Um, and so Jerry kind of continued uh, the the ideas that Dan had first kind of exposed me to, and to the idea of civil disobedience. I didn't do that while I was at Unity Kitchen, but um, both Dan and Phil would come, and uh, actually mostly Dan would come, and Dan would say the mass, and our Sunday mass, and give the sermon, and then Phil was in prison for most of the time that I was at the kitchen. He got out shortly before I left, and the difference between the two was striking, because Dan would say kind of the same things, which were kind of anti-nuclear, anti-military as an institution, but he's such a poet that most of the people who came um, didn't really understand what he was saying, I think. But Phil, I don't know if you ever met Phil, but Phil was very straightforward, to the point. Uh, you you had you weren't at all confused about what Phil was saying. You have to stop the bombs. You have to stop the wars. And at that point, this was the late 70s, so a lot of the homeless guests that we had were Vietnam veterans. But even more than that, I met guys there who had been homeless since they were discharged from World War II. And so really started to see the connection between war and homelessness. But I just remember Phil was so clear about what he was saying that we almost had a riot, because so many folks were veterans, and that was their last experience of, quote, normal life. And so they didn't take real kindly to Phil's sermon, and we kind of actually one guy challenged him in particular, and we eventually kind of escorted him out the door. But I was beginning to see with Unity Kitchen the connections between, the Catholic worker emphasis on providing hospitality to folks in need, and on the notion of nonviolent witness against war. Does that make some sense? Okay, so I was there for about 2 years, and then Unity Kitchen went through a drastic change. We At that point, there were three guys who were basically running it: Peter King and Ron Jaworski and myself. Henry had gone off to the Catholic Worker House in St. Francis House in Chicago. They had sent out a letter saying that the house was going to close down unless somebody came, and so Henry and another guy who had been involved decided to go, and they stayed for about a year, and then folks from the Chicago community, like Kathy Kelly, got involved, and amazingly, as you know, we just went to, well, we were in Chicago just before what was it, the 50th anniversary of St. Francis House. But it was in 78, it was on the verge of closing down if a couple of outsiders didn't come. Anyway, Ron and Peter and I were running the place. Ron hurt his back helping a couple of our guests move a refrigerator up to a third floor apartment. Um, when the guy who was helping him kind of dropped it on him, and he insisted on getting it the rest of the way up to the apartment. At which point he found that they had a perfectly working refrigerator already there, kind of typical for Unity Kitchen. Um, but at that point, we got into a discussion of whether we could keep the dormitory going, with Ron laid up and just Peter and myself, and decided that we would have to close the dorm, which through we would usually have 70 or 80 guys staying there, and they all got thrown onto the streets. We tried to help them get onto social services, which sometimes worked, most of the time didn't. We had one guy who had been in mental hospitals who ended up like tying a rope around his arm really tightly so that the bottom of the arm was swelling up, because he was so frustrated by their demands that he, go and do so many job applications, when I mean he just wasn't capable of doing that. So it was a terrible time. And then um, Anne and Peter decided that they wanted to, as they put it, grow smaller to serve the hidden Christ. So they kept the dormitory closed, and the meal went from something that would a meal that would, feed anybody who came, to a meal where only what the first step, at which point uh, Ron and I left, was that you had to have a reservation from at least the day before in order to eat. And even if they had open spaces, if you didn't have a reservation, you wouldn't be allowed in. The first day that happened, one of the volunteers quit and took the people who were waiting outside to his trailer and just, bought hamburgers and had a cookout with them. Um,
Could I stop you there and just ask you, like, so I'm thinking, like, what happened in the dynamics that created that big of a change, right? Like, was it that you couldn't find somebody else to come in and kind of join you to like replace the gentleman that gotten injured? But then even so, like, what would cause people's attitudes to change kind of drastically around this meal?
that's a great question. I wish I had a good answer. But the to put it briefly, uh, Peter and Ann had been tending in that direction for quite a while. That was one of the reasons why Henry left. That I think he had been there for so long that he was able to kind of keep the kitchen from going in that direction. Um, they there was also the influence of a Syracuse University professor named Wolf Wolfensberger, who came in, and he did sort of this program evaluation of social services from his point of view, and criticized us, uh, in part because you couldn't tell who was the guest and who was the server often immediately. That was, he said, demeaning to the guests. Um, and maybe it was. I remember one time, a couple of the homeless guys came up to me and just said, "Hey man, why don't you clean yourself up? You've given us a bad name," which was one of my prouder moments. But they decided to have a much more elaborate meal to 24 hand-selected guests. And, they continued doing that until the kitchen just closed down about a year ago. I think you probably met Peter in Chicago because he was there.
Yeah, and the small pile of their I don't know what you call it, programmatic literature.
Yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. Peter is a great proselytizer. Um, but I think it's been hard for him since Anne died. Um,
Mhm.
and he still does, he still has some homeless folks living with him. So he's still Unity Kitchen officially closed, but he still does some hospitality. So
Right.
he stuck with it for the long haul. But in any event, I ended up leaving and kind of went back to Cornell for a year, but then decided I would go in, get a PhD in sociology and study how Catholic workers did, quote, hospitality. Um, be, you know, because uh, I was pretty burned out, but just perplexed by the very question that you asked, Lori, is how did you go from kind of one extreme to another of from unlimited kind of almost unconditional hospitality to a very limited select hospitality. Um, and so I enrolled in the sociology program at Nazareth. My wife and I just got married at that point, and we moved into what we called a house of semi-hospitality, also in Syracuse, called Slocum House, where we lived with um, an ex-nun, and it had usually three or four guests staying with us in just a regular old house. Um, and also at at the same time, this was the summer of 1980. Um, a place called Jonah House, which was kind of a Catholic worker type house, but really a house of resistance in Baltimore, Maryland, that was started by Phil Berrigan and Liz McAllister, had declared 1980 the the year of election. And instead of having a huge demonstration, they committed themselves to having peace demonstrators from around the country and even outside of the country uh, at the Pentagon every day of 1980. So they put out a call to all Catholic workers and other peace groups, and a group from Syracuse went down in the summer, I think it was June of 1980, and spent a week at the Pentagon. We'd go out in the morning and leaflet and and picket there, and then we'd come back, and in the late afternoon and evening we'd have workshops and learned a lot about nonviolence, about nuclear weapons, uh, you know, uh, and and then at the end of the year for the Feast of the Holy Innocents, they invited everybody who could to come back for a more major demonstration, which in that case it was several hundred, probably 400 people or so there. And the plan was to reenact the story of Jericho, that we would walk around the Pentagon 7 times, bang on pots and pans, make a great noise, and see if it would fall down. Um, well, we only made it about 1.5 times around, and somehow spontaneously the group just went back to the original spot without completing it. The Pentagon, as you know, is still standing. Um, and but Liz McAllister just kind of greeted everybody with, well, at least we've proven one thing, which is we will not be militarized. We can't even follow simple directions. So anyway, I that was occurring about that time. And at the same time, as I'm starting my classes, um, every every Good Friday and every um, August 6th, Jonah House would pour blood on the pillars of the Pentagon, um, which and they put out a call that year to go down and do that again. And I decided that it was time for me to do some real civil disobedience. So I went down and we did like a 1 day workshop at Jonah House to learn how to, to learn how to pour blood on the Pentagon, but also to learn why you might do that. Because I'm sure any psychiatrist with a copy of DSM-5 could find a dozen different ways to categorize me for having poured blood on the Pentagon, a crazy act. But
And briefly, how do you pour blood and where do you source blood?
um, well, we had a nurse come and take the blood out of our veins the night before, and then kept it in the refrigerator, put it in baby bottles, and the so that it was our own blood that was being poured on the Pentagon. I don't think we kept track of the baby bottles enough that I knew that it was exactly my blood in the bottle, but mine was in one of them. And you had to be trained kind of carefully because the cops were there. They knew that we were going to pour blood on the Pentagon. And if you got one drop of blood on a cop, and this was just before AIDS kind of got discovered. So blood did not have quite the fearful uh, aspect to it that it did as AIDS began to spread. But if you got one drop of blood on a cop, then it would be charged with assault as well as depredation of government property. So you had to get up there, and the first thing you learned was, it was winter. This, this was Feast of the Holy Innocents. So you keep your bottle in the pocket of your coat until you get the signal that it's time to pour the blood.
So it doesn't like coagulate and
No,
block up.
so that the cops won't know who's going to pour the blood, so that they won't get close enough that when you
Squirt it out.
pour it, that it might get on them. So you want to keep it a secret who's going to pour the blood. So you wait for the signal, and then you reach down and you take we kept the blood in baby bottles, in part because that was, a good container, unlike a plastic bag or something, but also because of the horror of thinking about blood in a baby bottle, but which kind of mirrors the horror of, the babies that get killed regularly out of decisions that come from that building. And so we learn, have it ready to pour as soon as you do it. You also had to learn that you do it with an underhanded motion. So you twist, pull it out, and then you should be about 3 feet away from the pillar, so that the blood will mostly go on the pillar and not back on you, or somebody else. And you do it klutz that I am, if I was doing it on my own, I would have gone like this, and the blood would have gone behind me rather than on the pillar. So there actually was a technique to it. And later on in Syracuse, when we poured blood on the Federal Building to protest, this was, I think, the second anniversary of the murder of Archbishop Romero. I had to train people in how you do it effectively.
And then one last question, and then I'll let the subject go. So, and then from the cops' perspective, are they looking at a crowd of people? Like, do they know blood's coming? They just don't know from who?
Exactly. I mean, they know because it's Feast of the Holy Innocents and it's the Jonah House crowd there that someone is going to do it, but they don't know who, and so they don't. So they move in and arrest you afterwards, and if it's all coordinated, you can kind of get it done. And without, without any cop being,
Quote unquote assaulted.
yeah, being bloodied up or anything. And, I mean, you also, though, did have to learn the symbolism, because the Berrigans were always into what they would call parabolic action, or, symbolic action, where they would argue that things like militarism are so deeply embedded in our culture, in our worldview, that it's almost impossible to logically talk someone out of it. That what you need to do is to create a symbolic action that will allow at least some people to kind of step out of their worldview and maybe just see things from another paradigm. Um, and and so the idea of pouring blood on the Pentagon is not that you're, dirtying up the Pentagon, but that you are revealing the blood that's already there. That the Pentagon is a bloody business. People die because of decisions made in that building, and that in some senses it's a service or a enhancement of the truth value of the property to put blood on it. And if you're a psychiatrist, you'll probably still decide that, there's some categories of psychosis that could be applied to anyone who uses that kind of reasoning. But it kind of appealed to me. I like the idea of doing symbolic actions, if that
Like rending the veil, as it were. Like rending the veil. Or like,
yeah, or just doing something that might let people see what they're doing in a different way. And so, so we did that. We got arrested. We were released and given separate court dates. And this was during my first year of graduate school, and so I had to go. The first person to be tried was found guilty of depredation of government property, given 3 months in DC jail. And so I was the next one to go. And so I called up my parents and told them to tell them that they would not be seeing me. My brother, who was at Carnegie Mellon at the time, was living at home and answered the phone. And his response was, "Well, I understand that you were upset about this, but, what about Martin Luther King? He protested, but he never went to jail." And my response was, "Well, where do you think he wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail from?" But anyway, we went down. I went before the judge. First, I saw the police officer who had arrested me outside the courtroom. So we chatted for a while. I was asking him about what other protests had gone on at the Pentagon and all. And we went in. The prosecution speaks first, so he brought up the arresting officer who saw me do it, the buildings manager of the Pentagon who estimated the damages at several $100s, saying that so much blood had been poured on the Pentagon that they had to now use expensive chemical solvents to get it off. And I mean, I was tempted to say, well, what about soap and water? That usually does a pretty good job, but it's the Pentagon. And so then I had a statement prepared, and I got up to make my statement, and the judge, in a judicial way, said, "Sit down and shut up." And he said, "Well, the charge in this case is depredation of government property, and there are several elements to the charge. One is that property was indeed destroyed. A second is an estimate of the damages. And we did get an estimate of the damages, although the judge said that seemed a little excessive to me. And the third that it was government property. And he says, and nowhere has the prosecution given me any evidence that the government owns the Pentagon. Case dismissed. And I walked. And I mean, the poor prosecutor almost had a heart attack because he'd been presenting this case dozens of times, and no judge had ever asked him for the deed to the Pentagon. I mean, and apparently, there is such a thing as judicial discretion. The judge can assume that the sun rises in the morning, and the judge could probably assume the government hasn't been renting the Pentagon all these years. But this was a new judge. He had just been appointed, and he'd been a defense attorney. And I think he was feeling, well, this poor schmuck. If I was his attorney, I could have gotten him off easy, and so he let me off. But it was in a lot of ways that was good. But I had just come from Jonah House, where Phil Berrigan had given me a big hug and said, "You are the conscience of the community," and then I just wimped out and that went back to Syracuse. So, but that, it would carry on. Like I said, I'm a firm member of Wimps for Peace. I've done some small jail time and all, but never, never hardcore prison time. Just a little bit later, we did and if these stories bore you, just stop me, because I can go on for a while. On the second anniversary of the murder of Oscar Romero, a group of us in Syracuse with a Catholic worker decided to pour blood on the federal building there. And so I trained people how to do it. This time it was a big wall rather than pillars. And, it was pretty effective looking. It almost looked like a firing squad wall. And then we stood there with our bottles, and the federal security guards called the police, and the Syracuse police came, and, they did kind of that police walk where they walk between us and the wall, and, they look at us, they look at the wall, look at us, look at the wall. And then they went over and talked to the security guards for a while. And then they did the walk back, looking at us, look at the wall, got in their cars and drove away. And one of our friends was standing close enough to the federal security guards to overhear what happened. And basically what the Syracuse cop says, "Well, do you remember what happened at the VA hospital last year?" And what had happened at the VA hospital last year was a patient in a wheelchair had set himself on fire, and the city fire department was called, got there, was met at the door by the director of the VA hospital, who said, "This is federal property. You have no jurisdiction here," and turned the fire department away. And so what the cops said was, "Well, if that was federal property, then this is federal property too. You handle it," to the security guards. And so that time I didn't even get arrested because of a year-old dispute between the federal government and the city of Syracuse, which I always use as an example of labeling theory in my sociology classes. So anyway, go ahead.
I'm curious, can you describe, if it isn't too uncomfortable, what's it like taking these things as far as you took them, and then you use the term wimping out. Can you describe a bit more of what that is phenomenologically like, as it were?
what that is phenomenological. Yeah, it's the wimp in me uh, heaves a sigh of relief. Um, and in some ways, one of the things that I like to do with civil disobedience is to have a plan for a symbolic action that you will do, and you stay there and accept responsibility for it. And if the police arrest you, fine. If they don't, there will be another occasion. They don't go away. Um, and that's sort of been, the story of my life. Eventually, I did start getting arrested um, and going to jail a little bit. Um, so I don't feel tremendous disappointment because there will undoubtedly be another time. And it's just when you start thinking that you've got it down and nothing's going to happen, that's the point where the criminal justice system will come down on you. Um,
When you did these things, were there like press there? Was part of the idea that there would be people kind of there to like tell other people what was happening and that would raise awareness, or you know, how did
um,
attention get drawn to it?
not we didn't always have press there. It depended on the action. Sometimes they would, sometimes people would try to call the press. They didn't always show. Um, you'd you'd often get more press when you went to trial. And another part of this strategy, if you will, of civil disobedience is to try to bring the issues into court. Um, that except for one time when I went to court, I would always represent myself, because if you have a lawyer, even a pro bono lawyer who's sympathetic to the cause, lawyers are pretty much trained to try to have their client found not guilty, which means they often will try to keep you from saying some of the things that you need to be said. Like for instance, when you when I go to court, I would always uh, say what I did, and if the government was charging me with what I actually did, I would not contest, the facts of what I did. Um, what I would do is to try to get some space to explain the motives, what the issue was. Um, a number of times I used what's called the necessity defense, which the Berrigans had kind of started using. Um, it goes against Gandhi's principles of civil disobedience, where Gandhi says, when you go to court, plead guilty and ask for the maximum penalty. Um, in some states, and for a while in the federal government, there's a principle or a defense called the necessity defense, which in which you admit that you broke the law, but you argue that you broke the law to prevent some greater harm, that you had exhausted all legal alternatives, et cetera, et cetera. And so you would admit that you broke the law, but then try to start talking about the harms that you were trying to prevent. Um, the first time that I did this, and well, the first time I defended myself in court, I ended up with going to jail. Um, so I was teaching for a year at Union College in Schenectady, and we were a group was protesting Ronald Reagan's aid to the Contras, in Nicaragua, if you know that, some of that story. And so we blocked the road in front of the National Guard Armory in protest, um, and were all arrested very quickly. I mean, I think I spent less time blocking the road than I would have actually crossing the road before we got arrested. And I went into court and did the necessity defense, and basically argued that I was trying to prevent the murder of people in Nicaragua by Ronald Reagan's Contras. I brought in letters that I had written, copies of letters that I had written to my representatives and senators, and sometimes responses that indicated they weren't going to do anything about it, to show that I had exhausted all legal alternatives. Um, and by the end of it, the judge says, "You argue better than most lawyers I know." 15 days. He said guilty, because the harm that I was trying to prevent was not in New York State, that I couldn't use the necessity defense to protect people from being murdered in Nicaragua. Um, and then he gave me a choice of 15 days in jail or paying a $200 fine. And I chose the 15 days. And that was an instructive experience because my professorial colleagues at Union, especially those in the history department, all thought I was a lunatic. Why just pay the $200 and get out of there? But when I got into jail, you sit around talking with people about your court case, and when I told them what I had done to a man, and of course I was all in a male wing, to a man, every one of them said, "Yeah, $15, 15 days, $200. Yeah, I would have taken the 15 days." What was lunacy to the professors was a rational economic decision to the folks who were in jail, which kind of establishes what the sociologist John Irwin said decades ago, which is that jail is basically a holding place for the rabble, for the poor. That it's and there are of course racial elements in that as well. I mean, when I was being led away into the holding cell to be transported to the jail, the white guard said to me, who had seen what had happened in court, said, "You shouldn't have done that. This place isn't for people like you." And he was trying to be nice, but I mean, I think we all know he meant this place is not for white middle class people.
We're all for sort of grounding ourselves in the history of people's experiences in the Catholic worker movement. So, although I mean, as you probably know, we're a lot less. I'm interested in learning about the protests, but to me, where it's still a little hard for me to relate is like it just seems like these things don't have the effect that the Berrigans and the Dorothy days and you have hoped for. And I don't want to dismiss.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be too curt and dismissive of it, but what would you say to people that feel like this is a kind of, like, for lack of a better term, boomer politics, that younger generations are kind of too cynical and nihilistic to be able to identify with?
Well, one of the things that I argue is the difference that between fruitfulness and effectiveness, which I first heard articulated by Henri Nouwen a long time ago, which is, we're in such a capitalist industrial culture that effectiveness is sort of the model for how we think about how what might flow from from an action. And it's a very mechanical model. I do this, I do this and I choose the most effective way of accomplishing my goal. But I think you can also talk about it in terms of fruitfulness, which is a, and I'm almost embarrassed saying this to someone who really is a farmer, but it's a more agricultural metaphor or way of thinking about it, that you plant the seeds and you take care to water and all that, but ultimately it's sort of out, out of our hands whether that seed actually grows. And you plant the seeds and they may things might happen that you didn't anticipate at all. My favorite example for that is, well, I have two. One is Franz Jagerstatter, the Austrian peasant who, refused to be drafted into Hitler's wars, was executed, imprisoned, given many chances to get out, refused, was executed. Everybody said he was crazy. He, basically left his wife and children without a breadwinner, and didn't save a single Jew, from extermination, totally ineffective. And yet, some almost 20 years later, Gordon Zahn, who's been associated with the Catholic worker, went to Germany and to do a book on German Catholics and Hitler's wars, which was very critical of the stance of the German Catholic bishops. But he heard rumors about this Austrian peasant, and so he went back and interviewed everybody he could find, who knew him, and wrote a book called In Solitary Witness, which came out in the early 1960s. And among other things, it was read by a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who says that that in part inspired him to release the Pentagon Papers, which would play a big role in changing American public opinion about the Vietnam War. And so you could say that Jagerstatter's action was totally ineffective in terms of the Holocaust and World War II, but it had an effect. It was fruitful in a way that could never be anticipated in, changing American attitudes towards Vietnam. And on a much lower level, more concerned with hospitality, I remember my friend Henry, one time there was a guy named Pete who was one of the homeless men who slept in the shelter. And he'd been homeless for some years. And then one morning, Pete complained that he had a bad back. The shelter that we had ran from 8 at night till 7 in the morning. And it was 7 o'clock and Pete was complaining about his back. And Henry said, well, Pete, why don't you just, stay here for the day and rest up? And he'd done that dozens of times, but in this one particular time, it changed Pete's life. He decided his major problem was not drinking as much as gambling, but he gave up gambling. He became one of the workers at the kitchen, helped to work, he did his nights doing the shelter, and he went back and he remarried his ex-wife, and I don't know if it was a marriage made in heaven, but they stayed together until she died. And Pete would never hear a bad word about Henry. And Henry wasn't going out to rehabilitate him, or he had no therapy program intended, but it was just an act of kindness, which just bore fruit in ways that could never have been anticipated. So that would be kind of part of my answer is that if we're trying to be faithful, and the Berrigans usually express this in terms of faithfulness versus effectiveness rather than fruitfulness, but I kind of like the idea of fruitfulness, that you never know when an action might move someone, or maybe even move a number of people to see things differently and even to act differently. Does that make any sense? The,
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah. And definitely. And so then here's part of, now we're at kind of the cutting edge of how I've been thinking about these things. So I feel like I'll just use my time at the other Catholic worker here in Kansas City as a kind of abstract example. So I feel like there's two things that tend to be done. So there's we're calling for justice, for peace, for like a concrete change in how the world should work. The American welfare warfare system should be obstructed. So there's this kind of grander claim that is pushing towards. It's hard to not interpret that as calls for effectiveness, it seems to me. And then there's this other pole where, yes, it's Dorothy Day wrote a biography on Saint Therese, and if it's this little way, we don't know what the butterfly wings will cause, the waves halfway around the world, and that to me is true. And so I guess where I struggle, people have told us with the JP2 farm that we should, start a newsletter, and potentially that's a way to get fundraising. And then if we raise funds, maybe we can be effective, if not fruitful. And where I have trouble is anytime I think about what I would write, I feel like what I would be talking about are just such fragile personal relationships that to talk about them and try to turn them into this effective a money raising scheme, or even to inspire people, would somehow or other maybe do violence to the people and the stories.
that is a great point, one which I really agree with. I mean, you should not exploit people or people's stories, especially for fundraising, and maybe even not to make a valid point. I mean, although one could say that I did that in my book, but always using pseudonyms and things like that. And it's one of the reasons. Well, like at both Unity Kitchen and St. Joseph's House in Rochester, we would never allow someone to photograph any of our guests without asking permission, and including news photographers or something. Might be as close as we get to being violent, kind of keeping people from doing that. Because I think that whereas some of the others, like the rescue missions, will have photographs and people's stories for fundraising purposes. So I think that's never acceptable. I don't, um, but in terms of doing a newsletter, I, I think if you're doing it not so much for fundraising, but you can kind of sometimes raise some awareness of what's going on locally. I mean, when I wrote and then for a while edited the St. Joseph's House newspaper in Rochester, I would almost, I would feel disappointed if we didn't have if we didn't have at least one person cancel their subscription because of an article that I wrote. That was almost how I judged the success of the article, was if I got somebody upset enough that they didn't want to get the paper anymore. And some other folks would in the house wouldn't like that approach, but um, I think, and I think also, just one other thing for me about doing civil disobedience is that it really changed my relationships in the way I did hospitality. Um, I remember, especially um, when we were protesting the first Gulf War. We trespassed on Seneca Army Depot, which was then the second largest storage facility uh, for nuclear weapons in the country, and it was within the Rochester diocese, about an hour and a half away from Rochester, and so we kind of felt the special responsibility uh, for that place. But we about 30 of us trespassed. Three of us were what the judge probably thought of as slow learners, because we had done this before. And so we were tried and eventually sent to 3 months of detention in the Salvation Army Community Correction Center, which was here in Rochester. The Salvation Army doesn't advertise this fact when they're doing their fundraising at Christmas time with the Santa Clauses and ringing the bells and all. But they in Rochester, they run a community correction center, which is um, part of their adult rehab center, which is kind of an unlicensed alcohol and drug rehab center. Three of the dorms were devoted to prisoners, and so we were just part of this, but under different technical control. We were under the Federal Bureau of Prisons and a federal probation officer living here. But a, a number of the folks who were in the other dormitories for the rehab were folks that I had known from St. Joseph's House in Rochester, where for 35 years I ran the Saturday meal there, to give the regular workers the day off and bring in church groups to do the meal. And so I knew a few of those folks, and I convinced my probation officer that I was so important to the Saturday meal that they agreed to release me on Saturdays to do the Saturday lunch at St. Joe's. And so it was an experience where I had breakfast with these guys at the Salvation Army, and then I went and served them lunch, and then I went back and had supper with them. And it really changed, I think, the way that I interacted with folks, and made me a lot more open to kind of individual demands. I got much more of a sense of, kind of a need to control what kind of food you eat. When at the Salvation Army, you had no control whatsoever. You ate what they gave you, or that was it. Um, and it also kind of, that, and also seeing some folks I knew, while I was in jail, you develop a totally different relationship, because I think, because when you're doing hospitality, you're still, the server, sort of. There's a power, you have a power there. But when you're in jail together or uh, in the Salvation Army together, you're really more equal, and you just kind of get to know people in a real different way. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but I've found that that's another way in which kind of doing civil disobedience can influence hospitality in a good way. I don't know if did you guys ever know Lana Jacobs from one of the Missouri Catholic worker houses? Steve Jacobs was her husband, but I remember once saying that the one of the good things about doing civil disobedience is it makes you more honest at the door of a Catholic worker house, because you never know if the person knocking at the door asking for something might be your cellmate one of these days. And it changes the way that you do hospitality. And I found that you know, I don't go often enough that's a real likelihood, but it kind of sharing the jail experience a little bit with people can put you on a different level of relationships with them, I think.
Mhm. Right. And it reframes, to your point, it reframes how you think society works. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, and it opens you up to a kind of personalism. It seems like is what you're describing too.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. Um, it's, yeah. I mean, the more that we can get away from of us serving others, it's Dorothy used to say that it's only by our love that the poor will forgive us for our gifts of charity. Uh,
I guess
and
part of what I want to know is why is it? Because it is hard to work with other people, whether they're poor or not. And it seems like, I mean, another way of looking at this is only if you're in an extreme circumstance, like being in jail or protesting a war, does that make people feel equalized. I don't know why it's so hard for people to not just cooperate and work together, but it is. It's extremely hard compared to doing those kinds of things. And it almost always implodes. And it seems like it's regardless of a person's economic status. Like you can have arguments with people who have no money, and you can have arguments with people who do. So like why is it, and this is a truism I think of human nature, that under extreme circumstances, whether it's going to jail or dealing with a natural disaster or somebody dying of cancer, under those circumstances it becomes fairly easy to relate and to deal with each other as equal human beings. But as soon as there's any degree of like let up and peace and any sort of, in the situation, then, people get the daggers back out. So like, what have you thought of that? I mean, like, is that maybe part of the reason why these experiences are equalizing experiences, is because that's what it takes to make people see each other that way?
um, I think that might be the case to some extent. I think also um, people, if you're in these situations with people, um, I they kind of get the sense, more of a sense that you understand what their life is about and understand their point of view because you've shared at least some of that experience. At least that's the feeling that I've gotten from people that I've met in jail that I've you know that I've known. And um because if I'm just serving in a soup line, you're only seeing someone in a single context, and it kind of goes back to that personalism when you're only seeing people context of one set of social roles, you don't really see the whole person. But if you can see people in a couple of different social situations, then you can come, I think, a bit closer to understanding and being able to actually put yourself in their place, and they for you, I think. So I've always thought, that, in my experience, I don't know what you guys have found, but at most Catholic worker houses or uh, soup kitchens, that people come, and especially white middle class people, come to volunteer largely either from a charity perspective, where we're here to help these people, or from a social justice perspective, where they've been fighting in the abstract for social justice and maybe doing civil disobedience and getting arrested, but have had very little contact with folks who are actually marginalized, and particularly folks who are poor. And often I've found, I think there's a tendency, if Catholic worker houses are going to split apart, it might be along those lines between the charity-oriented folks and the social justice crusading-oriented folks. But the ideal of a Catholic worker house, I think, is to internalize that conflict between the two. Because the two do, I mean, the hospitality operates, on a day-to-day level. You're doing the same thing, whereas Peace Witness usually operates on a more sporadic level. You gear up for an action and then not, and so there's a real conflict there. But I think the ideal is for someone involved with the Catholic worker to embody some of that tension within themselves, where you begin to see both sides. And of course, Spencer, I'm sorry, I'm not including the farming, which is the third aspect, I would say, because I've had very little experience with that. But trying to get people to kind of internalize that conflict, to see that both or all three are part of the Catholic worker approach, and that although there's conflict between trying to accomplish all those things, there's also, I think it can be very fruitful for people to try to do both. And I've seen people who have kind of come just wanted to do charity and then began to see some of the social justice issues that lead to so many people coming in need of food, in need of shelter, in need of clothing, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm. You're right. No, and I totally agree with you at like a theoretical level, and ideally all of that can be integrated. And there's a lot of devils in those details of how you pull it all off.
Oh yeah, and a lot of times the attempts to pull it all off, kind of fails. Like I said, my wife and I have participated in community supported agriculture for some decades, but I've never really tried to integrate the farming part, and I find it difficult enough to integrate two aspects.
Let alone the third.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's I was recently talking to one of our friends here in Kansas City that volunteered at the other Catholic worker, and I bring him up, he's relevant in two ways. One, he would say he got involved in the Catholic worker somewhat for the charity, somewhat for the social justice, but partly because he knew it was one of the few places where it would be really hard to reject him. And then two, he asked one time, he's like, there's kind of within like 15 minutes of where I am, there's three other Catholic worker, or either Catholic workers or an adjacent kind of intentional community. And he's mused before. He's like, you would think that there would be more collaboration between the two, and or um, that there would even be more like intellectual agreement about foundational things. And I thought about that for a long time, and I concluded that, well, like it all depends on your vantage point, like from the out from like a normal bourgeois perspective. How different really is the farming Catholic worker from the social justice food kitchen Catholic worker from the other intentional communities, but from inside of them, kind of what you encountered at Unity Kitchen. Do you want to go hardcore Catholic? Do you want to focus on the farming, on the protests, and all of these things when you're talking about people devoting their lives to this and not getting a lot of financial and resource return on these? It creates this kind of, I don't want to exactly say competitive environment, but I guess I don't have a better word for it than a competitive environment. That's the state of my theory. I guess what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is largely true. I think pe I mean, there certainly have been a lot of Catholic workers that have fallen apart or have gone, and in some ways, that might not be a bad thing because, if you stick around as long as St. Joe's in Rochester, you might become too institutionalized and too set in your ways. Um, I remember talking with Pat Farron, who was the son of one of the founders of St. Joe's here, about something like that. And he just said, well, it doesn't really matter if the Catholic worker goes out of existence as long as people are doing the works of mercy, the Catholic worker is still around. That that and I think the vision, the Dorothy and Peter's vision was broad enough that it can be implemented, I think, really well in a number of different ways. I mean, you can emphasize the farming and do a bit of hospitality. You can emphasize at Unity Kitchen, in the old days we emphasized the hospitality almost to the exclusion of everything else, except for Jerry Berrigan, who kept pushing us in that other direction. Uh, but it and in some ways maybe an individual community can't take on all aspects, but you take on as many aspects as you can do. I would say reasonably incompetently is how I would put it.
Sure.
If that makes any sense or not.
Yeah, definitely. There's the old quote about like, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing, even if you can't do it well.
Yeah.
It's worth doing poorly. I think that's the line.
Yeah. No, no, no. I mean it, and certainly, I don't know, for me, part of the Catholic worker is putting yourself in a place where you're not going to be able to do things well all the time. I mean, at least for me, the worker is a place where I can't sit back and say in a self-satisfied way, well, boy, I did a great job. Because usually there's some way in which I've fallen short especially when you're dealing with folks who are really marginalized and have a lot of needs. You're not you're putting yourself in a place where there's not an easy answer, where nothing that you choose to do seems like it's, quote, the right thing or something that you're going to be proud of. But if you want to be able to be proud of everything you've done, maybe the Catholic worker is not a good place to go, because I've always felt, and I've only had a few years of actually living in the Catholic worker, but it can kind of push you to your limits. And, that emphasis on no rules means that unlike in a social service agency where you can say, well, I'd really like to do that for you, but it's against the rules. At a Catholic worker, even if there are rules, they get broken all the time. And so you have to say, I'd like to do that for you, but I can't do it. And, kind of admit some of your own brokenness there. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but I've certainly been in that position a goodly number of times.
Right. No, I mean, I think so. Is doing this more extreme form of living. It definitely pushes you up against your own limits and other people's limits, like yeah. In my cynical moments when we were having our breakup with the other Catholic worker, I was like, this feels like it's like some weird grad school experience where what we're being shown is how these ideals you believe in these ideals and then you come to a Catholic worker and then you will be quickly disabused of these ideals in practice. Or that's what we encountered there. And then I'm crazy enough that I've kept going in this. But I see how for a lot of people, they're like, yep, I did my time. I did my sort of anarchistic AmeriCorps experience. And
Yeah, well, and I'd say I'm probably one of those. I mean, I made my compromises when I decided to, become a professor and instead of continuing in the struggle at Unity Kitchen or something like that. And I've tried to mix that life a little bit. We do occasional hospitality in our house, but it's not anything that I would call a worker house of hospitality by any means. Um,
And you do have opportunities to help people all the time. We do as professors. I mean,
oh,
I've dealt with students who had no money and no solutions, and I've been able to get them into positions where they can get the support that they need on a fairly regular basis. And I think that people don't know that about our job. I mean, you can intervene and really change a person's life. So I don't
yeah.
think it's I think wherever you're planted and wherever you are, you can choose to help people or not, and I've certainly had lots of opportunities, and I'm sure you have too.
A few here and there, yes. Yeah, yeah. And I've had students who have been or became homeless at times. So yeah, even in the university, you can
Oh, yes.
run into some things where you may be of use. But it's I always think that the Sermon on the Mount is is an ideal that we're seriously called to, but unlike I think it's so interesting that so many kind of fundamentalist churches are and movements are trying to get the Ten Commandments put up in all these federal buildings and government buildings, but nobody's talking about putting the Sermon on the Mount up there. Because I mean, the Ten Commandments, yeah, I haven't done it, but if somebody might theoretically be able to actually follow them all and claim, yeah, I've earned my salvation. But Sermon on the Mount, we're all going to fall short, and that's why Jesus offers that redemption because we're all falling short of the standard that he was calling for. And I mean,
right. And hence why there's always a frantic push to basically say, usually not this clearly, well, we can't do the Sermon on the Mount, and if you want to do that, go for it. That's all well and good, but that's a sort of super additional layer on the basic spiritual life most of us are living, which is just trying to not mortally sin.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And yet, yeah, I mean, but certainly Dorothy Day was calling for us to do more than that, and or to
Mhm.
try to do more than that, which means we're going to fail. But
Mhm.
that's I guess I feel as long as you keep trying to live the Sermon on the Mount, then you've got to be able to deal with failures and your own weaknesses, but you don't give up.
Right.
Some
Right. And there's opportunities to be faithful and fruitful anywhere you are, whether that's in jail or teaching at a college or working at a worker.
that that is true. That is true. I mean, it doesn't have to be in the structure of a worker. It is more, the way you approach your life and your lifestyle. And I mean, you know, certainly disagree with the military as an institution, but I've met, uh, a goodly number of soldiers and veterans who are trying to live a good life and certainly have higher moral standards than I do, maybe. But I think, there are maybe some lines of work where it's easier to be good. I
Mm.
think about Dorothy's old saying of creating a society where it's easier to be good. Um, because there certainly are a lot of jobs where I think it would be very difficult to be good if you're doing those jobs.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess I think about it, the line from St. Paul about, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And there is, and that doesn't mean we should celebrate these intrinsically evil institutions, but on the other hand, I guess you shouldn't. It seems to me we shouldn't get so focused on effectiveness that we lose sight of the fact that there's still people running these things, and that God is still trying to work with them and through them.
Yeah, and I think even if you're doing civil disobedience, I think you can approach the folks that you're interacting with, police or guards or military personnel, in a spirit of nonviolence. Um, I just remember one time two of us were arrested. We were we were actually climbed the fence and were praying the rosary at Seneca Army Depot when it had the nuclear weapons. And it was on I think it was on a weekday, and so the head of security had to come out and arrest us because most of the people had the day off, and he had to keep us in his office for hours because we had an accomplice who had brought a fence to help us climb over the base fence. He brought a ladder so we could climb over the base fence. And so they were convinced that we were the decoys and the real saboteur was our friend, that he was somewhere on the base trying to sabotage the nuclear weapons when he had just taken the ladder and gone home. Um, and the guy was complaining, the the head of security was complaining constantly that this was his birthday and his wife had baked him a birthday cake, and I get to waste all these hours dealing with you jerks. And so when I got back, I sent him a birthday card, apologized. And when we saw him in court, he came over and said, "Wow, that was really great. I never expected to get a birthday card from you." And I mean, he still, testified against us and all that, but it was kind of a more there can be a more human spirit to it. And I think that can particularly occur if you're going fairly regularly to a place. You can begin to establish relationships with the guards, and that can be uh, maybe a way of bringing a little bit of change, or at least getting everybody to see that there's human beings on all sides, and there are good, we all have our good aspects and our bad aspects. As Gandhi said, we each have a piece of the truth, but nobody has the whole truth. And that was his justification for nonviolence, was that I never have justification for using violence to convince you of my truth. I can only use, discussion and my willingness to suffer, because none of us has the whole truth.
Can we talk a little bit about your upcoming class on Berdyaev? We haven't gotten to that yet.
Sure, we should do that.
Yeah, what do you have in mind? Is maybe because we can also sort of separate out the segment to let people know what you're going to be doing. It's on what is it, December 16th, right?
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
Monday, December 16th at 7 p.m. Central Time.
yeah. Well, I thought I would do, the this whole series concentrating on personalism, and kind of starting off with Berdyaev, because uh, he is my favorite personalist, and Spencer will be there to keep me honest um,
I'll
uh,
try.
about it. But I'm going to focus, not just on his personalism, but try to look at, his whole lifetime, and his, the various sources of his thought. Um, Probably the two books that I most focus on, that are The Destiny of Man and Slavery and Freedom. I think Slavery and Freedom is my favorite book of his. And one of his crucial concepts, I think, is objectification, and as the opposite of personhood and the opposite of spirit, because he talks also a lot about kind of spirit, freedom, and personhood as being um, not quite synonyms, but on one side of the aisle, and domination and objectification on another. And one of the things that really impressed me about him was kind of the rigor with which he rejected any objectifications of human beings, which, as a social scientist, that's really what I was trained to do, was, to classify, to do quantitative research, to put people into categories, which is, simply a way of objectifying. I mean, I think, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a manual of objectification. I would have loved to see what Berdyaev would have written about that. Um, but I think his message that we need to reject objectification is one that's probably even more relevant now than in his day, because I think the forces of objectification have really expanded in their power. Um, and we need to think more about how we can bring about a more spiritual power that can address this. If that, and some of the objectifications include our institutions. Like, we talked about the military as an institution, but capitalism as an institution is also a means of objectifying. Um, and objectification can be a great danger for the church itself. I think we've seen some of the problems that have occurred, within our own church and within other churches. So that I think is what I'm mostly going to talk about. I'm going to give some of his biography. I love the fact that he was imprisoned by both the Tsar and the communists. That uh, that his message was revolutionary. I want to look to it. The In some senses, he was an anarchist. He had one of my favorite quotes from Berdyaev is from Slavery and Freedom when he talks about um, the words of Caiaphas, that it is better for one man to die for the sake of the nation. And he says that that is the state's confession of faith. The state will always say that it's better for an innocent person to die for the sake of the nation. And in that moment, the state always gives its vote for the execution of Jesus, which I've read that quote at so many demonstrations we've had, and we do an annual Stations of the Cross publicly on Good Friday, and uh, I always read that there. So I think you know he has some real insight, in some things more perhaps than Mounier and Maritain. Um, but then in the second session, what I want to do is to look more broadly at European personalism, centered on the French personalism with Mounier, Berdyaev, Maritain, bringing in Martin Buber, some Jacques Ellul, since he was kind of a later personalist, but also a sociologist. So I can appreciate his sociology as well. And John McMurray, who was a British personalist of about that time. Um, Look at that. And then for the final section, want to also bring in American personalism, and kind of focus on how uh, American personalism, which was mostly Protestant, had a major effect on Martin Luther King. It was European personalism, which had the major effect on Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And I still haven't figured all this out. I've got to do a lot more reading on the American personalism, but somehow see how these two different branches, um, led to figures who were not were not just theorists, but were activists and very much trying to put personalism into practice and to use it for changing society. So that's sort of what I'm hoping to build up to. Does that make some sense, or?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like a great course to chart.
Yeah. So, in 3 sessions, right? 3 sessions over one
Yeah.
month, or how are you going to do it?
Um, Originally we were talking, I think, about, every other month. I'm
Okay. Yeah.
flexible on that. Maybe do every other month or something, and
Yeah. That's
give it
fine.
time.
I just want to make sure people knew. I hadn't looked at the calendar to see how far out we'd gone. So, but I think that's lovely.
Yeah, and my Monday nights should be next Monday is my last night class on Monday nights. So Mondays will be, if that seems to be the day that you prefer. So those will be free. Uh, you
Going
know,
for Okay. But for sure, Monday, December 16th for Dia.
well, it's been great talking to you, and
Thank you for taking the time to do all this and share your story.